I think we're pretty good. I'll go ahead and introduce you now. So welcome everyone to the Anthropology Colloquium. Thank you for coming. Today we have Kristina Jacobsen to talk with us about her research on Sardinian songwriting and language reclamation. She is an ethnographer and singer-songwriter and cultural anthropologist. She's an Associate Professor of Ethnomusicology here at UNM with a secondary appointment in Anthropology at the University of New Mexico. And her research focuses on language reclamation, expressive culture, popular music, and arts-based research methodologies. In her first book, The Sound of Navajo Country, Music, Language, and Diné Belonging, which was published in 2017 at UNC Press, is based on 2.5 years of singing and playing lapsteel guitar with Diné country Western bands on the Navajo Nation, and was the winner of the 2018 IASPM-US Woody Guthrie Award for the most outstanding book on popular music. Jacobson is a touring singer-songwriter, fronts the all-female honky-tonk band Merlettes, and is the founder and co-facilitator of the UNM Honky-Tonk Ensemble. With support from the US-Italy Fulbright Commission and the Wenner-Gren Foundation for Anthropological Research, she recently completed a year of ethnographic fieldwork on Sardinia for the project Sing Me Back Home, Ethnographic Songwriting and Sardinian Language Reclamation in Italy. And while in Sardinia, she also recorded an album, that was her 4th album, of original songs collaboratively written with Sardinian songwriters and language activists. House on Swallow Street with the Sardinian label Talk About Records. That's coming out in a couple weeks. She also founded and facilitates 2 culturally immersive songwriting intensives on the Navajo Nation, and beginning this year in Sardinia. At UNM, Jacobsen teaches the cross-listed music and anthropology classes, Navajo Expressive Culture, Country Music and Cultural Politics, and Anthropology of Music and Sound. And so, before the talk starts, I will just ask you all to please turn off your cameras, unless you're Kristina, and that just helps us to conserve bandwidth and make sure everything's flowing well. And also when we get to the Q&A at the end of the talk, you can turn your camera back on if you have a question, and that will sort of be our signal that you're going to ask a question. And also, of course, please mute your microphones just to cut down on background noise and such. So without further ado, Kristina, thank you for presenting.
Thank you so much, Josh, for the introduction. Buongiorno, saludi a te, good morning, everyone. Thanks to the Anthropology Department for the warm welcome, and to Ian Wallace for the invitation to speak today as well. Thanks also to Kate Rhodes for being an important early interlocutor for some of the material that I'll be presenting on this morning. I'm excited to be with you all virtually, and I'll look forward to other in-person conversations in the post-pandemic future and at the end of this talk this morning. So I'm going to be presenting on a chapter for my forthcoming book from 17 months of ethnographic research on the Italian island of Sardinia, as Josh mentioned, where I was living and teaching as a US-Italy Fulbright scholar last year. And the tentative title for the book is Sing Me Back Home, Ethnographic Songwriting and Language Reclamation in Sardinia. You'll also be listening to some songs this morning from a new recording project that was recorded in the house where I was living in the small village of Santo Lussurgiu in Sardinia. And this CD will accompany the book as a multi-sensory, multimodal ethnography. The CD is called House on Swallow Street, and it comes out independently as a CD with Talk About Records, as Josh mentioned, on February 15th, and will be available in most major streaming platforms. So the ethnographic fieldwork that I've been doing in Sardinia involved a number of things. And so I'll just briefly talk about that, and then I'm going to get into telling you all a story and unpacking it with you all this morning. So my ethnographic fieldwork involved teaching and leading workshops at the University of Cagliari in Sardinia, where I was teaching, studying 2 versions of the Sardinian language, writing songs with interlocutors and other musicians and poets and storytellers across the island of Sardinia, playing shows by myself and with other musicians, participating in a Sardinian line dancing troupe, participating in village festivals, religious, musical, and otherwise concerts, village celebrations, and doing multiple interviews throughout the course of these 17 months of field work. So here are a couple images just to give you for us to place ourselves and to know a little bit about where I was doing my research. This is the front of the house that I was living in. This is the view from the balcony in the village of 𝗏𝗏𝗏. And then just a couple images of some of the collaborations that I was working on musically and otherwise throughout the course of my field work. And these are with various songwriters, Sebastiano Desanay, Matteo Leone, a very well-known blues and roots artist on the island, Matteo Scano. This is also Matteo, a well-known accordion player, teaching music lessons. This is with the Jump Blues Band, and also collaborating with the group that I'll be talking about this morning. So I'm sitting in front of a microphone in a recording studio in the southern Sardinian city of Cagliari, guitar poised and ready to record with musicians 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 In this image, Daniele is on the left and Matthew is on the right. 𝗵𝗵𝗶𝗆 is from southern Sardinia, and 𝗔Ｈ𝗁𝗃 hails from the island of Sicily. It's late morning in July, and already it's sticky and sweltering hot. There's no air conditioning, and the fans have been turned off to avoid bleed through into the recording of an original co-written song in Sardinian in English that we're about to begin. Seconds before the engineer presses the record button, lead singer, bluegrass musician, and songwriter Matthew turns to me abruptly and says in Italian, "I don't think I'm going to be able to record this song today." Confused and eager to begin, I ask him to explain. He explains that the engineer will understand him when he sings in Sardinian. Even more confused, I respond, "Of course he'll understand you. You're singing in Sardu," and he also understands Sardu, or Sardinian. "That's exactly the problem," he explains. "I've never recorded or sung in Sardinian, and he's never heard or recorded me doing an original song. It's too intimate." After putting the session on pause for 30 minutes, drinking yet another espresso, and talking it through with Daniele, we returned to record the song we wrote, 𝗖𝗍𝗃, a song chronicling the passing of Matthew's late maternal grandmother, a sharecropper from the Wild West Sardinian village of 𝗖𝗍𝗃. What can this micro moment in a Cagliari recording studio tell us about Sardinian language stigma and the cultural intimacy of Sardinian or Sardu? And what can it tell us about ordeals of language, or as Ellen Basso calls them, moments when we permit our own voices to be powerfully affected by the language of the dominant? Based on my fieldwork touring as a solo singer-songwriter, performing with bluegrass, country, and Americana groups, and in this talk I'll collectively be referring to those genres as roots music, in Sardinia, where I was also studying the Sardinian language and co-writing songs with songwriters from across the island, this morning I examine ordeals of language, cultural intimacy, and language stigma, using the space of the recording studio as a window into Sardinian language politics and language ideologies writ small. In this talk, I employ musical participant observation via songwriting and recording as a way to get at the lived experience of these questions using a methodology that I call ethnographic songwriting, collaboratively writing ethnographically informed songs with interlocutors in the field. I argue that collaborative songwriting as a shared narrative-based interpretive art form is not only a powerful form of deep hanging out, to quote Goethe's felicitous term, it is also a powerful window into the affective, everyday, and socially intimate uses of language in Sardinian social life. Thus, methods that comprise ethnographic songwriting bring together not only songwriting and ethnography, but also through a focus on storytelling, performance, and anthropology, the arts, the humanities, and the social sciences more broadly. So ethnographic songwriting is a method, and I'll talk briefly about this methodology, is a method that I've coined and created to describe this arts-based research methodology that informs both ethnographic research and songwriting. So this is drawing on recent research in the adjacent fields of ethnographic poetry, Renato Rosaldo, Stone, Melissa Conman-Taylor, Christine Weber, Adri Kusero, Author Zia, among many others who are working in this area. And so it's a collaborative form of musical participant observation, where ethnographer and interlocutor are fully involved in the creative process. Using Lassiter's definition of collaborative ethnography as an approach to ethnography that deliberately and explicitly emphasizes collaboration at every point in the ethnographic process, including the conceptualization of the project, fieldwork, and most crucially, the writing. In songwriting, this idea of collaborative ethnography includes the writing of the lyrics, the melody, the chords, and the shaping of the song's narrative, all the way to the end of the recording, the mastering, which is one of the final processes in production, and the final production of the song. Crucially, ethnographic songwriting also includes choices around language use and the languages selected for a song. When used and written in this way, songs become a type of long-form interview, of relationship building, and of intercultural exchange with a concrete product, the song, to show for it. Ethnographic songwriting is also ethnographically informed songwriting, where getting the details and the facts right within a specific cultural context is essential to the credibility and believability of the song. As I say to both my songwriting and ethnography students, specificity matters, but it is also ethnographic research itself, living in community for an extended period of time and becoming a part of a community that creates room for the possibility of songwriting and creates a culturally sanctioned space in which collaborative songs can happen. For example, without my history of living in Sardinia each summer, over the last 4 years approximately, performing and touring, I would not have been able to connect with the musicians and community members that I ended up writing songs with. At the same time, it is ethnography that takes songs as a form of cultural narrative, storytelling, and as expressions of identity, culture, and self seriously and on their own terms. Songwriting is a form of world making, where when songs are successful, an entire world is created in 3 minutes or less, giving us a sort of sensory deep dive into other worlds, lesser known languages, and places. So in this broader schema, I've come up with 4 types that I've used with some regularity in my own ethnographic practice. And this list is certainly not exhaustive, but to share those here, these include songs that are written on my own, inspired by a specific fieldwork experience. This includes collaboratively written songs with others, and this is the area that I'll be focusing on most today in the song that I'll be sharing with you. So songs as a sort of as a form of long form interview, an extended interview. Another type is translations of songs, and here I'm very interested in ideas of translation and transduction and language reclamation. One example of this on the forthcoming album is a song, an original song that I wrote about a female bull rider that was written in English and is placed in the American South. And for this project, I ended up translating this song into a very specific variant of the Sardinian language. And in the process, some of the content of the song was also shifted to reflect Sardinian worldviews and understandings of things like ranching and rodeo, and to resonate with the Sardinian listening audience. So this sort of these questions and the conversations surrounding creation and translation of songs. And then finally, another method that I've been using with ethnographic songwriting is using songs, co-written songs, in this case as playback or as part of playback sessions. And here I'm drawing on the work of Stephen Feld and Aaron Fox and Louise Menkes and others, where you can create focus groups and then songs and stories elicit oftentimes other stories. So you play a song and then someone else, it reminds someone else of another memory or something that happened to them a long time ago. And so this can become a method of eliciting deeper and richer stories from people and from your interlocutors and listeners. So Sardinia is a semi-sovereign island that has always been fiercely independent from the Italian mainland, which is often referred to by Sardos as il continente, or the continent. And you can see geographically that it's roughly equally distant between Algeria and Tunisia and the Italian mainland here on this map. Officially made a part of Italy during Italian unification in 1861, Sardos spoke primarily Sardinian or Sardu, a Romance language akin to Latin that incorporates Byzantine Greek, Catalan, Spanish, and Italian due to serial occupations of Sardinia by these colonizing groups. The process of language shift to Italian began shortly after Italian unification and intensified after World War II, when Mussolini created compulsory education island-wide in the Italian language, with Italian increasingly playing the role of a prestige language across this rural island. As in many politically non-dominant language communities across native North America and in Europe, Sardos were punished for speaking their native language in ways that have generated intergenerational trauma related to language use and language choice within many Sardinian families. For example, older Sardos recall being forced to kneel on grains of rice, a standard Catholic penance for a variety of perceived transgressions, while reciting the rosary in standardized Italian as punishment for speaking in Sardo. Despite their colonial history, Sardinians have maintained a fierce sense of separateness from the Italian mainland. Granted status as an autonomous region in 1949, Sardinian was recognized as the island's co-official language alongside Italian in 1999. There is no single standardized orthography for Sardo, and orthographies are, in fact, hotly contested and a subject of frequent conversation and debate in Sardinia. Today, Italian remains the primary language of instruction in most Sardinian primary and secondary schools and universities, and is the primary language used in most official public spaces on the island. Sardinian is also now a minority language within the territory in which it was historically dominant. For Sardo, as for many minoritarian languages, there are shrinking domains of use in daily life. Typologically, there are two official versions of Sardinian, both of which I was studying during my fieldwork, Campidanese in the south and Logudorese in the central north. And so if you look at this map here, the orange area from about halfway down is where Campidanese is spoken, and the gold and yellow areas is where Logudorese is spoken. In the far northern region that's green, that's actually Gallurese, which is related to Corsican. So typologically, there are these two official versions of Sardinian, Campidanese and Logudorese, with many gradations in between, Arborense and Nuorese among them, alongside a number of languages spoken on the island and not considered to be Sardinian in origin. These include Sassarese in the city of Sassari, Gallurese, as I mentioned, Tabarchino, which is related to Genovese in the southwest, and a variant of Catalano in the city of Alghero. Variants of Logudorese and Campidanese are mutually intelligible with concerted effort, and it is common for speakers to have a fairly comprehensive knowledge of both Logudorese and Campidanese. Of the two major variants of Sardinian, Logudorese is considered to be the most prestigious. This is for various reasons, both ascribed and real, including the perception that Logudorese has the least influence from Italian and has served as the primary written language of literature in Sardinia. Campidanese, the version of Sardinian used in the song that Matthew, Daniele, and I recorded in the recording studio that morning, is considered by many Sardos to be a lower status version of Sardinian due to its earlier contact with Italian and the perception that it is a less pure version of Sardo. Today, Sardo remains the largely oral language of the countryside, and there's a strong ideological, linguistic, and generational divide between rural identified speakers of Sardo and more urban identified speakers of Italian. However, even for those who do not speak Sardinian, there's also a strong felt attachment to Sardo. Many monolingual Italian speakers from Sardinia still consider Sardinian to be their language and Italian to be the language of someone else. Thus, on the one hand, Sardinian is reified as deeply or ur-Sardinian, while at the same time one's ability to speak it is almost categorically labeling one as quote unquote primitive or anti-modern. Many Sardinians need Italian to be and feel modern and cosmopolitan, but they need the Sardinian language and Sardinian music to feel and be Sardinian. So I'd like to play this song for you now. And this is 𝗤𝗏𝗏. We have two versions. This is the version that was recorded in 2017. The version that's coming out on the album is slightly different, but this is the one that was recorded in the studio that morning. So I wanted to share this one with you all. The encouragement here, and if you're inspired, is to share anything. This could be moods, thoughts, responses, a lyric that resonates with you in the chat as you're listening. And Josh is going to kindly share a link here to the lyrics so that you can follow them there. You'll see in the link to the Google Doc that's being provided, you'll see the lyrics in Campidanese, and then you'll also see the English translation for the verses that are in Sardo. So here is Tiria.
I think we lost the song. Is it still playing?
Okay, so I'm getting a note that the sound is not coming through. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think you got muted for a moment for some reason.
Oh, okay. Let's try it again. Let me go back. Did you hear it in the beginning?
We heard about the first 20, 15 seconds. Probably.
Perfect. Okay, so let me start right here. Give me a thumbs up. Maybe when I muted myself at 1:08, give me a thumbs up if you can hear it now.
Mi botta addosso, facci tua, può ascoltare un poeto da dire. Su silenzio te mangiamo, su sono contagioso, voci che callenta da suore. Amore mio, ti faccio bene una cosa, sarebbe fatto svilo su gioiosa. Se si Sardegna è un luogo senza tempo, cantando stai io in un momento. Take me back to the space, take me back to the mess, back to the wildness inside. In the stillness of the morning, open the door to a place that smiles to me. Pensatori, no parlo mai di vita, pensamento, bello in sa memoria. Spari fatti in domo, su carta severa, sa vita bella scorre dentro. Take me back to those fields, take me back to the present, back to the wildness inside me. In the sun morning, open the door to a place that was lost in me. It's a story as old as the West. We are too out. Manca sfalcata sta ruga che arriva da sta Grecia, non da pari che si cambia. Come nuda stisurropio, pegando a pugonotto, canno fiasta in susappa mia battaglia. Take me back to this fearless day, back to the mesa, back to the wildness inside me. In the stillness of morning, open the door to a place that was lost in me. Take me back to the fearless day, back to the mesa, back to the wildness inside me. In the stillness of morning, open the door to a place that was lost in me. In the stillness of morning, open the door to a place that was lost in me.
Okay. I wrote 𝗤𝗄𝗄 with Matthew. So now that we've listened to the song, I'll talk a little bit about it. I wrote 𝗤𝗄𝗄 with Matthew in a coffee shop and an outdoor courtyard, 𝗭𝗄𝗄𝗵𝗵𝗏𝗍, in the suburbs of the southern city of 𝗏𝗏𝗄𝗏. And here I've mapped out 𝗏𝗏𝗄𝗏. And then you can see 𝗪𝗏𝗪𝗪𝗪, which is the small village where I recorded the album and did the majority of my fieldwork, and then the northern city of 𝗏𝗏𝗃𝗃 that I'll be talking about in a moment. We began the writing process from a timed prompt, asking us to write about a place that we loved using all of our senses. And I'm sharing some of the prompts if you're interested in this today, and Josh has kindly offered to drop those into the chat. So another document will be provided there. We then shared the parts that we'd written with one another, jotting down the lines we loved most from the other's free write, and then discussed what themes had emerged and what, in our estimation, united our two writing sessions. As we wrote our songs, we sought to merge our worlds and viewpoints of both the American Southwest and a village in southwestern Sardinia, where Francesca, the matriarch of his family and the woman who taught him Sardu, was born. So here's a photo of Matthew or Matteo with Francesca. The verses of the song are all in Campidanese, as you all saw, a primarily country language spoken in Sardinia's southern region, including the village of 𝗤𝗄𝗄, and the choruses, representing our unified life experiences in rural Sardinia and my own living and ranching on the Navajo Nation, are in English. At the same time, there are other linguistic factors at play, among them that Matthew in our song was writing a song in a language which is in many ways still new to him. He wrote the verses in Sardinian and I wrote the chorus in English. In these cases, and since it was never intended as a song focused on philological correctness, he is likely drawing on the word that comes to him first, whether that's in Sardinian or Italian or a mix of the two. In true country fashion, it is a song that focuses on rurality, nostalgia, family, and emotional loss. Sonically, Matthew wanted it to have an up-tempo bluegrass feel, so we also wrote the choruses with that in mind, and asked Daniele to play the banjo on the recording. Matthew sings lead in the verses, and I sing harmonies on the chorus and the bridge and play rhythm guitar. As you saw in the translation of the lyrics, the song chronicles Matthew's childhood visits to 𝗤𝗄𝗄𝗃, the quiet mornings, the magic of discovery, and then in a bridge or the transitional section of the song, plays specific references to both Sardinia and New Mexico, specifically Albuquerque. The song was written with an emphasis on the senses and from a felt sense of place, in which we attempted to evoke those feelings in the listener as well. Matthew's voice, described in Italian as cavernoso or cavernous, is rich, low, and deep. In this regard, I sometimes refer to him on stage with his consent as the Waylon Jennings of Sardinia. And Waylon Jennings is no longer with us, but he was the very famous founder and a famous singer of the so-called outlaw movement in the history of country music. In the final verse, and the one I find the most affectively moving, you'll hear Matthew start to sort of whisper sing, almost sotto voce, as he references the moment of his grandmother's passing and the connection he felt he lost with her, with 𝗤𝗄𝗄, and even with Sardu, as it is imagined to reside in the rural, far from the place Matthew now calls home in the city. As our moment in the studio reveals, language politics in Sardinia are fraught, and purist language ideologies also extend to sound and song. 𝗏𝗏𝗿𝗍𝗃, associated as the language of letters and with being more pure, is considered by many Sardinians from the north and south to also be more Sardinian. For speakers of Sardu, purist language ideologies are often internalized. Those advocating for language fortification, notwithstanding, and here I'm thinking of Kate Rhodes's term, many speakers of Campi Danese I have met perceive 𝗏𝗏𝗿𝗍𝗃 as more beautiful, more poetic, and more pleasing to the ear. And almost to a person, speakers of 𝗏𝗏𝗿𝗍𝗃 believe 𝗏𝗏𝗿𝗍𝗃 to be superior, sometimes vastly so, when compared with Campi Danese. Building upon these distinctions between North and South, there are also keen and sharp divisions between those who speak Sardu and the approximately 1/3 of Sardinians who do not, exacerbating longstanding urban-rural and coastal-interior divides that I referenced earlier. For many urban identified Italian speakers who don't speak Sardu, Sardinian speakers from the island's interior are referred to as grezzo, which translates as raw or rough. And this is a pejorative term denoting a rural rube similar to redneck or hillbilly in a US context. This establishes a link between Sardinian speakers of Campi Danese and working class identified Southerners in a US context, something that I expand upon in the broader chapter, whose speech styles are also often designated as linguistically inferior. So all of this was at play, I argue, in Matthew's moment of pause in the studio, a moment of sociolinguistic disjuncture, in Gianpietro Guttuso, our engineer's recording studio, on a sticky hot July day, and in Matthew's decision to sing and record in Sardu for the first time. As someone who performs and records primarily in English, this was Matthew's first time not only writing a song in Campi Danese, but recording in Campi Danese. Gianpietro, a rockabilly artist and longtime musical colleague, our engineer in this moment, is roughly Matthew's same age. As two younger men living in an urban space, they had only ever spoken to each other in Italian, the primary language spoken in the city of Cagliari between residents and their age group, roughly 30 to 40. In a more recent conversation about the song and our performance of it, Matthew pointed out a second aspect of our recording session that I had missed. Not only was he singing in a new language, he was singing in a newer, more intimate and confessional style of songwriting, something Gianpietro had also never heard him do. It was as if in that moment, the shared secret of the language they both spoke, but had never spoken to each other, and a style of songwriting Matthew had never shared in front of his male colleague would be fully revealed, leaving them both feeling exposed and unprepared for what might follow. In any intercultural context, there are always questions of translation and translational effect surrounding the decisions we make when translating from one language to another and from one medium into another. In this case, live performance into a recording, for example. These choices and the complicated terrain we enter when making such decisions is what we might also call the politics of translation. Similarly, in seeking to transpose the sound of an American sounding country song into a Sardinian context, we were presented with which version of Sardinian to use. In a US context, country singers often feature frequent diphthongs, sometimes referred to as twang, in their singing, and speech styles that are strongly regionally inflected in their stage patter or conversational banter on stage. Most often, these are speech styles associated with the American Southeast. And as I told students in my country music class yesterday, this is so much so that even if you're a singer, a country singer from the Pacific Northwest, the expectation that you will still twang and use a specifically regionally inflected accent when you record and sing in country music is very, very high. Thus, in our song, Campi Danese was the closest Sardinian substitute for a country speech style, as it is perceived by Sardos as the southern working class cousin to 𝗏𝗏𝗿𝗍𝗃. Moreover, as the variant of Sardo with a greater number of open vowels, Campi Danese also allows for more play with the vowel space in one's mouth when one sings, thus allowing for a sort of linguistic play akin to the use of diphthongs in US-based country singing performance practice. This is not unlike how American English is perceived by many Italian speakers at large, as a version of English with sort of masticated nasal open sounding vowels that are difficult to understand. And for those of you that have seen the classic classic film An American in Rome, the character Nando does a great imitation of this, where essentially his imitation of American English is something akin to wah, 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 all these sort of large nasalized open vowels. The choice to then sing the chorus together in English creates a link between these two speech styles, while at the same time juxtaposing the two places referred to in the song through our code switching between Sardinian and English. Matthew's own approach to Sardinian in the song is also revealing for what it shows us about his own linguistic biography and knowledge of Sardinian. While his grandmother was fluent in Campidanese, Matthew is a passive speaker of it. He comprehends but does not comfortably speak it entirely on his own. Thus, the song serves as a marked space for expressing himself in a language that is both his by heritage and not his by speaking ability. In 𝗖cie, he sings a version of Campidanese that is mixed with Cagliaritano, an urban version of Sardinian from the city of Cagliari, inflected with Italian words. He did this, he says, to more accurately reflect the language spoken by his grandmother, herself a product of both the country and the city. So Matthew's own entry point into American roots music was somewhat circuitous, and the journey of discovery has always felt personal to him, as much about discovery of the genre as a discovery of himself. He was first introduced to country music through the country artist who serves as a sort of gateway artist for many country music converts, Johnny Cash. Matthew recalls loving the narratives and the stories told in those songs, and early on connecting these songs to his experience as a child going to the countryside to visit his grandmother in 𝗖cie. As a young adult, Matthew was introduced to the music of North Carolinian Doc Watson, a musician known for championing a style of acoustic guitar playing called flat picking, and for his own mix of Appalachian, mountain, country, and blues genres. But Matthew was introduced to Doc Watson via interpretations of another Americana music group, The Devil Makes Three, and some of y'all may know this group. This trio, known for fusing American roots music with a DIY punk aesthetic, also incorporates Doc Watson songs into their set. So introduced to Doc Watson in this way, Matthew did a sort of deep dive into Doc Watson's music, listening obsessively to Watson's many songs about the country in the American South as he drove around the Sardinian city of Cagliari to and from work and for shows with the Saddle of the Devils. Songs that we listen to together and that have moved him most deeply include the traditional murder ballads, 𝗭𝗎𝗋𝗋 and The Banks of the Ohio. In both songs, both of which focus on young women being drowned by their male partners, the dark subject of many Appalachian ballads, often sung for children, he particularly appreciates the bizarre cognitive dissonance of the happy sounding melody line with a tragic lyric that focuses in this case on femicide. As a nod to this sonic and linguistic disjuncture present in so many Appalachian ballads, when writing our song, we also tried to capture the idea of a happier sounding chord progression paired with a more melodic or somber lyric. And I've also written about this thematic elsewhere in a recent JANA article that looks at his own connections between his grandmother as a sharecropper and a song by Doc Watson called George Grudger's Overalls, for those of you that know it, and documents the history of a sharecropper in the American South. So he's sort of trying to make these linkages between a Sardinian South and an American South very actively in some ways. A country musician who also plays and sings punk and hardcore, Matthew loves the balance that the two genres, one more lyrical and intimate, the other more extroverted, active, and angry, provides him in his daily life. So, for example, right now he's playing banjo and electric mandolin for a psychobilly or psychobilly group called Slacker's Bunch. In selecting the Sardinian that is featured in 𝗖cie, he combined the Campidanese spoken by his grandmother with versions of Sardinian he heard spoken in Cagliari, the city where he has lived most of his adult life. Although typologically this mix of Sardinian and Italian, referred to as Cagliaritano, as I mentioned earlier, is a variant of Sardinian, it is dismissed by many Sardinian language purists as being neither legitimate Sardinian nor Italian. This mixing of the two languages, followed by a chorus sung in English, thus flies in the face of many purist Sardinian language ideologies, an example of contamination par excellence in which Matthew savors and delights. The Sardinian in the song, he notes, is a reflection of the imperfect yet functional Sardinian that he and many of his age mates speak in some form or another, and thus is precisely authentic in this way. As in so many country song traditions, it is a song of both the city and the country, written from the space of the city about the country. Performing bluegrass and old-time music for Matthew also does broader cultural work for his identity as a Sardinian. Learning, writing, and playing these music genres in particular allows him to, in his own words, 𝗭udere il cerchio, or close the circle, and return home to Sardinian music and life with renewed interest and curiosity. Similar to 𝗭𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏's concept of the reach and return, in which it is only once Zulu music has left South Africa and is recognized elsewhere in the world music market, for example, in Europe and in the United States, that it becomes real and gains status back in South Africa. Playing music from the American South and the American Southwest has validated rural music and speech styles for Matthew at home in Sardinia. This validation, in turn, has allowed Matthew to reconnect to his own Sardinian roots, including speaking and singing in Campidanese and learning about other traditional Sardinian music genres. Despite, or perhaps because of, the hegemonic role of American English and American music in a Sardinian context, roots music serves as a powerful form of decolonization for some Sardinian musicians, such as Matthew. He has, in fact, recently begun writing other songs in Campidanese, including political commentaries and songs like The Politicians of Today, which is on his Bandcamp page, and also listening with newfound appreciation to 4-part styles of a cappella singing that I was talking a little bit with Josh about before the beginning of this talk today. One is called Canto a Concurdo, and the other is called Canto a Tenora. As Matthew articulates, performing American roots music can fortify perceptions of music and language at home in Sardinia. So American music itself, and this is something I theorize more extensively in the chapter, becomes the site of transduction, where through the process of songwriting, recording, and performance, the energy from one genre of music and social world is harnessed to indexically signal another world, much closer to home. Understood as an interdiscursive practice that is generative, producing new objects, practices, person types, and knowledge, and this is from Susan Gall, transduction has yet to be theorized as a framework for understanding either musical performance or language reclamation, particularly in intercultural contexts. Thus, in the broader book project, I also draw on broader texts from Italian popular culture to examine this idea of transduction, including YouTube videos, comic strips, social media, locally produced B-movies on the island, and most recently overdubbed American sitcoms such as The Simpsons. And in the Italian version of The Simpsons, of course, it's all in Italian language, but then Willie, the janitor, speaks in a very marked, clipped Sardinian accent. So we can sort of think of the transposition of what a Scottish accent with US ears sounds like, and then transposing that to Sardinia, and that or to an Italian context, and that becomes a Sardinian speech style. So I want to talk briefly here about responses to this song in a variety of settings. Responses to 𝗪𝗪 following its initial release as a single also cleaved along lines of North and South that I've been talking about and gesturing towards today, reflecting the contrasting geographic and architectural environments of these two cities. Performing the song in the southern city of Cagliari, and here's an image of it here, for a room full of Campidanese speakers at the University of Cagliari, and this was part of a Fulbright lecture and performance that I was doing, responses were overwhelmingly affirmative. Listeners commented specifically on the combination of the bluegrass sound and the version of Sardinian that we'd chosen to record the song in. Similar responses were also shared by university students, second language learners, and American roots music aficionados. A particularly powerful response was shared by the goddaughter of Matthew's grandmother, a woman also from 𝗪𝗪 that Matthew had never met, and who was actually attending one of our performances with her country line dancing class that night. And this is a line dancing troupe called the Texardi that I talk about more in another chapter in the book. Here's a photo of them from the talk. By contrast, playing a recording of the same song for a room full of musicians, musicologists, and linguists in the northern city of Sassari, pictured here, responses, and this was at the University of Sassari, responses were much more measured, inflected also by larger age differences between myself and those in attendance, many of them in their 50s and above. One older gentleman, himself from Sassari, noted that for him the mix of Sardinian language with an American country sound was 𝗧gradevolē, or strongly displeasing. This is a response that arguably many residents of 𝗏𝗏 might have to hearing Campidanese in any context, whether spoken or sung. But it's also possible that the singing juxtaposed against the American bluegrass sound produced an even stronger reaction of displeasure. Another audience member worried about maintaining the purity of Sardinian language and Sardinian music if the language is being set to other forms of music and other national musical traditions. He referred to the song as a contaminazione, contamination, and expressed ambivalence over both the musical and linguistic choices made in the song. Things became so heated, in fact, that the host of the speaker series disinvited one attendee from attending future talks and performances, perceiving their comments to be, in his words, less than gentile or polite. I'll also just say as an aside that my own experience of studying the two main language variants of Sardinian simultaneously created a lot of complications and also taught me a lot in my own fieldwork process about language ideologies and language process. In particular, when I was in the village of Santo Lussurgiu, where I was studying 𝗏𝗏𝗿𝗶𝗏𝗆, I did not tell anyone besides my language teacher that I was studying Campidanese. And she called it our little secret. So we talked about it in the space of our language sessions, but it is not something that was discussed outside of that context because of how controversial it would have been viewed. For Matthew, responses to the song differ among three camps: his family members, younger musician friends, primarily from Cagliari in southern Sardinia, and what he calls the 𝗭ριστοι, the purists, language purists in this context. His family members, recognizing that the song was about Matthew's grandmother, were deeply moved. This was also my observation when we traveled to 𝗏 together to perform the song for his aunt shortly after writing it in the living room of his late grandmother's house. According to Matthew, the strength of this response was due in part to the subject matter and in part because of the intimate sound and nature of the song. Matthew's age mates and musical colleagues also responded favorably. An American-sounding song sung in Sardinian is novel and worthy of attention in this regard. The only critical responses Matthew received have been from fluent Sardinian speakers from rural villages or language activists living in the city. In this case, the critique is that he isn't using a pure version of Sardinian, that his Sardinian is imperfect, and thus that the song either misrepresents or contaminates the purity of an older, standardized version of Sardinian. These critiques also extend to the written representation of Sardinian in the song. Matthew's response to these critiques has been to provide the larger context of orthographic standards in Sardinia, pointing out that the Sardinian language has always been contested, has no single orthographic standard, and that a pure version of it doesn't really exist. As he noted in a more recent phone conversation, sempre ci sono stati puristi, there have always been purists. Equally important, the language he chooses to write in for 𝗏 is the version of Sardinian that Matthew actually speaks when he speaks in Sardu, and is the version of Sardu spoken by Francesca and those in the village of 𝗏 that we were trying to depict and evoke in the song. In other words, it is an everyday spoken, or to use Matthew's words, dirty or sporco version of Campidanese. Thus, the song makes explicit the distinction between the pure language of written texts and the messy, imperfect, living language of spoken Campidanese. The intertwining of Sardinian and American English within a hegemonic Italian linguistic framework also appears in other forms of language use relating to the group. For example, for Matthew, this intertwining manifests in the linguistic technique that he calls sporcare l'italiano, or dirtying Italian. As he describes it, this is an intentional technique of language resistance, where his spoken Italian, the language of formality, bureaucracy, rules, writing, science, is intentionally contaminated by affective expressions and response cries in both Sardu and American English. For Matthew, in moments when he is emoting most expressively, his most basic linguistic expressions are either in American English or they're in Sardu. They're almost never in Italian. So for linguistic color, neologisms, emotions, and to bring in more regional, dirty dialectal influences, he mixes Sardu and US English into his Italian. Dirtying Italian, Matthew says, is bringing it closer to everyday Sardinian life and language. This dirtying of Italian is also at play in the choice of stage names used by the members of the Saddle of the Devils and in the band name itself. Saddle of the Devils, while in some way sounding quintessentially American, even to the point of cliché, is actually the plural English translation of a major geographic marker in coastal Sardinia, La Sella del Diavolo, a beautiful geologic saddle that juts out over the Mediterranean Sea directly south of the city of Cagliari. In true country tradition, then, the band has incorporated a place-based marker into their band name and identity as a group, and then created a wordplay where devil becomes devils, denoting a certain kind of playfulness or devilish tendency in the image of the band at large. In this case, they've elected to use the English translation of that place rather than the Italian one as their band name. And so in this image here, you can see behind the heads of Daniele and Matthew, that geological formation, that saddle, that is the saddle of the devils right there, La Sella del Diavolo. So I'd like to briefly conclude here, and then I'm interested and eager to field your questions and discussion. So I'd like to conclude by briefly reflecting on the pleasurable complications of collaboratively co-creating the object of study, in this case a song, with my interlocutors, where a focus on creating the object is part of the study itself. In treating songwriting as a form of applied fieldwork methodology, we can think of it as, let me find my place. Okay, in treating songwriting as a form of applied fieldwork methodology, we can think of collaborative writing as an acquisition of a practice, as a communicative happening, and as a form of language play. As discussed in 𝗖cie, questions of text setting, ambiguity, and the choices made in the space of ambiguity also certainly constitute some of music's unique expressive magic. Further, conversations surrounding the song before, during, and after its creation constitute a different, more intimate, and everyday window into discourse analysis, tightly focused around a specific project and intended outcome. Last, as works of collaboration carried out over multiple years, co-creating art and story is a profound form of relationship building, creating mutual trust, rapport, and history between ethnographer and interlocutor as musicians. We know that ethnographic research is not and never was an objective endeavor, but here I propose that we view it instead as an interpretive art form where getting the facts right based on multiply positioned claims to truth is absolutely essential to our credibility as ethnographers, and where the balance of participant versus observer is always fragile and ever changing. Incorporating new forms of collaborative work, songs, poems, other expressive forms into our ethnographic inventory can offer alternate windows into the intersections of sound, social life, and language politics in ways that help us to attend to the intimacy and everydayness of language use, both spoken and sung. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kristina, for a fascinating talk. And we will take questions now. And if you have a question to ask, just you can unmute your video and go ahead and ask your question.
Great, and I'm gonna go ahead and stop my screen share just so I can see people's faces a little bit more viably. All right, there we go.
Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
Kristina, you made me create a book of questions. When I was starting to study cultural linguistics, I went to Europe, Germany, Switzerland, France, Spain, and I went to Switzerland, down to Italy. I thought Italian was Italian, you know, mangia, mangia, that kind of. And I didn't realize that you also had other languages incorporated into the Italian language. And I went, you know, I really liked Italian because the way I speak is similar to the level of Italian language. You know, one word that I found over there was the word Apollonia, which was the name of a lady who we had our grandmother here. Apollonia was her name. I said, how did we get that? How did they get that? Where did it come from? Anyway, what you're talking about are several different ideas that I was thinking about. We do have an identity problem within the Pueblos and and the Navajos, but we do speak each other's languages. And you mentioned decolonization, integration, and how does your Sardinia work these things out with the mainland Italy and English? That was the question, main question I had. Because here in our pueblos, we incorporate now English with our language. When we sing songs that there are native, but sometimes we sing English songs in between, or church songs like that. And we are now not singing anything. We just kind of gave it up. We don't have that tightness in the pueblo anymore. We're kind of afraid to go to the kivas, afraid to go and socialize, So until this COVID goes away, we'll probably get to singing our own songs again. So that was my question, identity.
Yeah. So tell me, thank you, Christopher, and tell me if I'm understanding your question correctly. So you're asking about sort of the relationship between English and Sardinian, and possibly also Italian, sort of how they all interact with one another in a Sardinian context.
Yeah.
Do I understand that correctly? Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. There's a lot of rich, and I sort of in a teeny window tried to talk about that in the context of this one specific artist, Matthew or Matteo. Yeah, I think it can't be underestimated, the power of pop music and American pop music in a Sardinian and an Italian context, right? Like that's the music that everyone listens to in a lot of cases. And so that, in the case of this musician, has had a huge influence on him, right? Not just in terms of the music he records, which is mostly in English, right? But also sort of how he thinks about himself. So I guess my short answer is that in this case, American music and American English becomes a way for some individuals to assert themselves against Italian colonization. So they're like appropriating in some ways this medium and this music from a totally different context, but using it as a form of refusal to say, I'm not going to sing in Italian, for example, is one way that it's used. And certainly code switching back and forth in that context between, Sardinian and English is another version. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi there. That was a wonderful talk. I have one question. I'm just wondering if you've thought about how whether or not your approach to using music to address ethnographic or anthropological questions could work for music that does not involve words.
Say a little more.
Well, I'm just wondering about, if say you couldn't speak a language and you were just sort of jamming with people and sort of understanding things more about sort of the structure of the music or even the gestures or something like that used to play it, like whether or not a similar sort of cultural insights could be had from just participation in creating music without actually having language be a key element to the cultural transmission or learning that's taking place.
Yeah, no, that's a beautiful question, Ian, because what I understand you also gesturing towards is like we can also make music with people without necessarily having to write a song with them or co-create something, right, more formalized, which can, perhaps also feel intimidating for folks that might not have, say, that kind of training or that kind of thing. Yeah, I love that question. I want to think about it a little bit more, but I would say, certainly being able to make music with people is a profoundly bonding, connective thing, whether we're playing instrumental music or whether we're singing with each other. So I would say, Mantle Hood, this much older ethnomusicologist, he had this whole thing that he called bimusicality. And the idea was basically that early ethnomusicologists were like making music with people as a way to sort of learn about other musical cultures. And he had this very sort of formalized method, but certainly like instrumental jam sessions were part of Mantle Hood's methodology, like how do we, and then I guess, for my part and for my research, I think part of the reason that I'm focusing on songs with lyrics and with words is because one of my bigger research questions is like, yeah, but what do we learn about language use? What do we learn in this particular case, say, about language reclamation? And that element would be very missing, right? If we're looking, but I think your body language thing is a very interesting thing, because my hunch is if we're not listening to lyrics, that we may have the potential to key in more to physical communication and to body language in that way. Yeah, so that could be a really fun sort of secondary thing.
Yeah. I mean, I was sort of thinking about it. I was thinking about it in the context of punk music or something like that. Like punk music is played all around the world, and people sort of sing in their own languages, but everybody sort of learns how to like play music like a punk musician, you know, regardless of language. So there's
can you feel? Can you do the chords? Can you play in that specific genre and then layer whatever words you want over it?
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, and in that way it can travel, right? Yeah.
Adopt the same gestures and things like that, you know, as I started to. But I did want to ask you one follow-up question, and that is, do you think that country music, or specifically, maybe not modern hot country music, but sort of older types of country music, do you think that that has like sort of a unique appeal globally? I mean, is there another sort of genre of music that has sort of the global reach that country music does? It strikes me that country music is remarkably popular in a lot of places in the world, and I just think that's fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, oh gosh, that's such a rich question. I don't know if I can comfortably make a comparison between country and other popular music genres and say like which one has traveled further, but I can certainly say based on my own research and studies that, I mean, country's reach is incredible. In Aboriginal Australia, in Kenya, I was just playing some songs for my students this week that are called 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 songs from the 1920s. And 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 is a transliteration of Jimmy Rogers. And so there's songs, and they're about this person that's half man, half beast, who is also Jimmy Rogers transposed into that context. And they're kind of country inflected. So I mean, yeah, country's travel is an amazing, amazing thing. For me, you know, I'm very interested in the ways it's traveled in First Nations and Indigenous communities around the world, and thematics of sort of land and loss and nostalgia and working class identification and how that translates into specific cultural contexts in like very, very powerful ways. Yeah, it's traveled to Japan, right? It's huge in the Czech Republic. Yeah.
Yeah, no, anyway, that's a great answer. Thanks so much for the talk. I was actually thinking about Australia. I have heard some Australian Aboriginal country music that is incredible. But yeah, it is really interesting, the far reach. But anyway, fantastic talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Christina. Absolutely fabulous talk. I could honestly sit and listen to you talk all day, every day. I just had a question about the reaction that you described you had at the Italian university. You said that there was definitely some detected resistance towards the music that you were playing. I was wondering if you likewise saw any shift from a negative perception to a more positive, more inclusive perception, or do you think that these negative perceptions are embedded so deeply within the culture that a single presentation probably isn't going to shift everything? But yeah, I just kind of wondered, was there any temporary shift from negative to positive based on your presentation?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Kimran. Here's my sort of my gut response. I think in the case of 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏, I think the fact that I was sharing the recorded version and that it was sung by a Sardinian singer, I think the strength of the response was in part that he was the one that was doing it. In my album, and you know, I wrote in the Sardinian language for a number of songs, and I ended up playing those live last year in some shows. And I would say I, as a non-Sardinian, am given a certain leeway to do that and to mix, you know, and sort of do those sort of melange projects that I think a Sardinian is going to be tasked with in a very different way in terms of the expectations of purity and language standard, mixing, contamination, all of those kind of things. So, where I've seen the softening or sort of the folks maybe moving towards or being more open to that kind of mix, as to your question, happened more in my, I guess, my own experiences of performing songs in those languages. It's a great question, you know, whether over time sort of there would be more openness to that. I remember being, yeah, like really surprised by the strength of the response. It was like really sort of intense moment in that way. Yeah. Thank you.
Do we still have time for questions?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I'm gonna try to, so I'm curious about like the meaning of country music, because in Sardinia, because in America it's kind of over the past, like since like the 1980s, it's kind of accrued this association with whiteness and conservative politics, and I'm wondering if any of that carries through in Italy, or is it kind of still unstated, or does it carry through?
That's such a beautiful question. So there's a separate chapter in the book where I'm going to be examining the very complicated uses and fusions of a version of the American Confederate flag that gets used by certain very specific country groups in a Sardinian context. So the answer is yes, in some contexts, but very, very inconsistent. You know, so you also find other groups, Saddle the Devils and Matthew included, where that is absolutely in no way, shape, or form their own politics. But what I think is interesting and complicated is that our American Confederate flag, and also right now in this moment, gets used in the Sardinian context to express a Sardinian desire for independence and for Sardinian sovereignty against the Italian mainland. And with an identification with Southerners, right? Sort of wanting independence from the Union. So that sort of maps onto that in some really, really complicated ways. So, you know, being used for this ostensive thing that a lot of people are supportive of, but the means that are being used to express that desire for independence, certainly from a US-based perspective, are incredibly fraught, right? So I remember, especially in my capacity as a Fulbright scholar last year, seeing that image and wondering exactly how best to have those conversations and feeling a very strong obligation to have those conversations. And also, as many of my colleagues very, very quickly told me, the Confederate flag in the Sardinian context, in their words, has been resemanticized and holds none of the meaning that most Americans would understand that flag to hold. So then how do you broach that particular conversation? So yes, it is absolutely a part of that scene, but I would say mostly in isolated cases. Yeah, thank you so much.
So I'll just say we can continue to talk and have further questions since we can't go up and speak with Christina after the talk as we normally would be able to if we were in person. So I understand that some of you may have to leave at 11 or 11:15, but as long as any others of you are willing and interested in continuing the conversation, we can stay on. I have a couple of questions actually.
Yeah, sure.
Kind of riffing a little bit off of some of the questions that have already been asked. There's two. The first is about ethnographic songwriting, which I think is a really fascinating sort of methodological conundrum, and the other one is about this idea of transduction. So about ethnographic songwriting, first I'm curious if there's sort of a typology that's been developed in that literature of different kinds of songwriting. I don't know, and it seems like there's obviously many differences in how people approach writing songs, but those are also individual. I've been in a couple of bands and they have had very different approaches to writing songs, and across cultures and across languages and traditions within cultures, there also are really different approaches. And so how do you sort out all of those kinds of differences? And to what extent is it seen as just an extension of other cultural patterns as opposed to kind of something more systematic in itself and maybe grammatical in terms of that tradition? And so that also gets to Ian's question a little bit about non-verbal kinds of music as well. And I'm thinking, I don't know if you've read Thomas Torino's ethnography of Sambudi music in Peru among Aymara speakers. He has a really fantastic, but it's not really, he's not doing the music with them. I don't think he's just observing them do it. So that's perhaps different. But the other challenge that it seems like you'd face is that there's kind of a premium on cohesion when you write songs together, that you really, I mean, it has to work together. So you don't have this thing that other kinds of ethnography have where you're sort of the awkward, you know, disfluencies that are constantly happening. And that's what you're learning from is, oh, I don't know how to harvest potatoes. And then you learn, you know, what actually makes a good potato harvest and such. I'll stop with that question.
Yeah, I mean, I love this idea of the sort of premium that's put on cohesion, even just in the simple effort to finish a song, right? To sort of have it be a fait accompli in some way or another. I will say, and there's a great ethnographer that writes about this in a different context with fado music in Portugal. There's also a lot to be learned, as we know ethnographically, from our moments of failure, right? Sort of like the moments when it doesn't work or when something doesn't cohere. And perhaps in some ways we learn a lot more in those moments because we learn about the expectations and all the things that were going into that particular moment, right? So, but I agree that that is a challenge, you know, is the premise, and if I'm understanding part of your question correctly, you know, is the premise on finishing the song or is the premise on building the relationship and sort of the, I would say generally I err towards the latter, because I'm in these contexts, I feel and see myself to be an ethnographer first and a songwriter second, in the sense that I want to build relationships, and that's the thing that I want to cohere and stay, right? The song then I see is something that is built out of that relationship and sort of layered on top of it. But they're not always finished and they don't always cohere, right? Or in some cases I've written fragments with people, or in some cases we came across stumbling blocks with language. Like, well, what language to do it in and who can even consult us on how to do it? Neither of us even knows this language, and how do we sort of do that or that kind of thing. So those were really, really revealing moments. As to the first part of your question, Josh, about typologies, do you mean, are you asking about sort of what, can you say a little bit more about that in terms of what methods are being used to write the songs? Is that what you meant?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, it seems like if part of what you're trying to do in an ethnography or in ethnographic songwriting is to understand the concepts that people are using in writing songs, the sort of assumptions about interactional norms and things like that, you know, who gets to make decisions and when, and all of the sort of micropolitics that happen. I mean, it seems like that there will be a lot of differences in how that plays out. And then also just about musical decisions and things like that.
Oh,
you know,
okay.
technical.
Okay.
Yeah.
So those are such beautiful questions. I hear these as questions that are pertinent for any collaborative ethnographic research, right? Sort of like a la Luke Eric Lassiter's definition or anything else. And then the part that you're asking about is, and how does that play out specifically in this method? And with, you know, the idea basically is that every decision that is made with the song from the very beginning to what I call the juice or the seed or the spark, right? Like that little concept that you run with, to the absolute final thing when we're pushing the CD out, and all of those songs, that basically conversation and decision making needs to be had at every single step along the way collaboratively. And if it breaks down at some point, that song then does not move forward, or at least I don't take it forward on its own, if that makes sense. So that it needs to be sort of brought forward together. As you can imagine, it becomes incredibly labor intensive and time consuming, because in the case of the album, I have 12 songs that are coming out, and every single one of those is like a whole relationship and a whole world that's sort of been built, sort of scaffolding and undergirding those particular songs. And those decisions. So basically we talk a lot about process. It's very, very process based, sort of, okay, what does this look like? What are our expectations of one another? What's realistic, what are our goals, and all of that kind of thing is discussed from the very, very beginning. But as you say, and as we all know, for those of us that have done fieldwork, like that, it's different with every person, right? It's a negotiation and a different conversation with every single artist or interlocutor or songwriter that we're working with. So it's a matter of constant negotiation and conversation is sort of how I would best describe it.
Great, thank you. Chris, did you have another question?
Christina, my question, can you do a comparison between the Navajo culture and Sardinia?
Oh, wow. All right. Chris, I'm going to give you the really pithy answer to that, and then I'm looking forward to having future conversation on other fronts as well. I mean, the thing that struck me when I first went to Sardinia 4 years ago were many of the resonances between a place like Sardinia and Navajo Nation. Why? Because they're sovereign or semi-sovereign in the case of Sardinia, because they have been through these histories of language loss and intergenerational trauma surrounding language loss, because language is a thing that divides a lot of families in two in terms of who speaks and who doesn't, and why, and all of the decision making that we know that goes into that within families and within communities and histories. And then by some very, very simple facts, for example, the fact that Diné communities, of course, have been herding sheep and identify as sheep herders in many powerful ways for a very, very long time. And there are more sheep in Sardinia than there are residents on the island. So sheep culture and sheep herding culture is a huge part. So for example, for those of you that have tried the Diné delicacy why am I forgetting the name of it right now, but it's essentially, blood sausage. So when you have blood sausage, right, that is the stomach, and then you have chopped up onions and carrots and the meat that's inside. I ate that exact same dish in Sardinia, the exact same dish. And so I began thinking, wow, isn't this amazing with pastoral communities and pastoral, cultures, the resonances that we see around the globe, right, with communities that are very connected to certain kinds of livestock, for example. Historically, also, Sardinia is matrilineal and matrilocal, like Diné communities are. So there are a lot of amazing resonances there. And then maybe most importantly, in the present moment, ideas of resilience, whether that's language resilience or cultural resilience moving forward, is a really deeply felt, strong impetus within both Diné and Sardinian communities right now politically. So I see a lot of resonances there as well. Yeah.
Great questions. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, so much.
I'll save my transduction question for another time.
Okay, but I'm eager to hear it. So will you send it to me?
I will, yeah.
Okay.
Thanks for the wonderful talk.
Yeah,
You're very
thank
welcome.
you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good morning.
You too.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everyone. Thank you for attending.